Amalia just said to me, "Si se puede." Yes, we can. I'm just going to hold on to a couple points from that last presentation that I think should stay in everyone's mind. And that is the whole question of looking very seriously at efficiencies. The counterside of that is being able to acknowledge the inefficiencies that we currently have in our programs. And also, too, to have a look, again, at the allocation choices we're making. Where are we putting money? The counterside of that is where do we not put money? Where do we need to put money if we are to have successful prevention and treatment programs? The next presenter, Dr. Karl Theodore, is going to further this discussion in looking at sustainability, looking very much at it from a fiscal point. What are some of the fiscal options? What do governments need to do? What has the region done previously? And Professor Theodore is the director of the Center of Health Economics at the University of the West Indies. He's also professor of economics in the Department of Economics, where he has taught health economics and generations of students across this region for many years. The work of the Health Economics Unit, which is one of the unique institutions within this region, has contributed to an improved understanding of the economic impact of HIV in the Caribbean. He was one of the people leading one of the first studies in this region over a decade ago, looking at the economic impact of HIV in the Caribbean. He's now responsible for training many young health economics and their understanding of the HIV/AIDS response. He's led a variety of research initiatives looking at HIV and health, but also, too, looking more broadly at economic issues of health and development in the Caribbean. It is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Karl Theodore.
Thank you very much, Ernest, and good morning to you all. I listened to the first two presenters and I kept wondering, it's rough to be a third presenter because, in fact, most of what you want to say has either been said or been touched upon. But then, knowing myself, I suspect there's something I will say which is slightly different. Just quickly, the outline, I want to touch on the issue of sustainability. And I'll begin by looking at the regional context, and then we'll look at what the funding requirement, because the focus will be on the financial sustainability of the HIV response. I'll have to touch on the issue of fiscal space. I'll make some broad suggestions for moving forward, but then one specific suggestion I call a bold step. I want to touch on that, and then a few summary statements. The dimensions, as we heard yesterday, the epidemic, and as Professor Whiteside said this morning, we are not doing too badly, but there are challenges. And yesterday they were shown very plainly. We have some countries, a few countries, where the epidemic seems to be under control. The new cases are reducing. But for most of the countries, that's not the case. We saw yesterday there are countries where the ratio of men to women was 2 to 1, and in others, women to men was 2 to 1. And we just don't know why. We also saw that the rate of decline of new cases over the last decade or so has been very slight. We also know that the economic situation in the region is not looking too good now. Countries reflecting low rates of growth or declining rates of growth. And the third aspect of the dimension I want to just touch on is the fact that this is a region where Many of the countries have been dependent on external resources for the response, for the national response. But the facts are that those sources are going to be drying up. We point to one source, DFID. DFID says it's going to cut its support by 32% to the rest of the world, and it's going to cut the support to the Caribbean by 100%. So we have nothing to get from DFID. And that is what we have to keep in mind. The challenge then is, I think there are two aspects to the challenge. So we have to find more resources from within the region, and it's really fiscal space, because it's governments mainly that will have to lead this response. But also, as the two previous speakers mentioned, it's really a question of doing more with less. We really have to commit ourselves to do more with less. What then is sustainability, but what it is we are looking for? What kind of resources we are looking for? Well, a few years ago, the HU and the World Bank worked out in a fair amount of detail what it would cost the countries of the region, each of them, to respond to the epidemic. And based on that, we have been able, in the HU, we have been updating that number over the years. And the last update says that for the region as a whole, the cost will be somewhere between $300 and $500 million per year, depending on how much we have to pay for the drugs. The figure we like to use is the 300 million as our target. Now, that we had worked out is the amount that as a region we are going to need. In fact, when you look at what we have been spending, we have been spending just a bit more than half of that over the last decade or so. So I'm saying, if we are looking, in fact, if we are looking to do a bit more, then it could be then that what we are looking for as a region is roughly about $180 million per year, which works out in terms of the income of the region, which is a little more than 60 billion. That works out to, as you see on the slide, 3,000, which is 0.3%, a very small fraction. Now, on the face of it, talking about sustainability, if you're looking at 0.3% of your income, that shouldn't be much. That shouldn't be much. Yet, there's a sense in the region as if that is a tough question. It really boils down, as I'm saying, to the political will, that commitment that we need to say, well, this is a serious epidemic, and that small fraction, we're going to have to find it. That is the commitment, I think, that we need. Now, some people don't like to hear me say it, but that this region has always been in a position to finance its aid. It has always been, because the amount that was required was always a very small fraction of our income. The facts are that many of the countries were in difficulty, and we were grateful for the external support that we have been getting. But I'm sure even the donors would agree that the time has come when, in fact, the countries have to look more seriously within themselves to continue funding the response to the epidemic. Just to look at three of the countries. I call them country A, B, and C. I don't want to call names. One country, between 2002 and 2009, those 7 years, spent $50 million US on HIV. but over the same period, that country's income was 135 billion US, and they spent 50 million. So they're spending 0.05%. 0.05%. That is so close to zero, it is almost embarrassing. The second country, much better. The second country, in fact, is spending on its health 5%. On the HIV, it ends up spending 0.2% of its income. Now, given that the benchmark we mentioned just now was 0.33%, the country spending 0.2 was still spending less than what we think it should be spending, but it's still not too badly off. And the third country is even better. The third country C, the data tells us they are spending 0.4%, which is a little bit more. So again, this is the HIV story. It's a mixed bag in this region. Some countries are spending way below what they are supposed to be spending, and some are in fact doing better. The issue, though, is that we have to find more resources, and it's fiscal space. And I'm saying what I'm suggesting here that there are two broad things, and again, they have been mentioned. You have to look for more revenues, but you also have to spend what you have better. To looking for more revenues, there are two things. Expanding the tax base is one, and increasing the effective rate of taxation. That is the next thing. Now, expanding the tax base, if the economies are not growing, that is going to be very difficult. But for some countries, you see, all expanding the tax base means is that upgrading the tax systems. There are some countries of the region that don't have any sales taxes, for example. Some no taxes on incomes. Now, in this day and age where the governments need resources, countries have to, in their fiscal systems, I think, have to include both income and sales taxes. There's the issue, as was mentioned before, the need to better target our resources so we get better value for money. Then the issue is, again, as was mentioned, the HIV response. If you could link the HIV response to other responses within the health system, that itself would be a better use of money. And the last issue of fiscal space I wanted to mention is that we live in a region where the incomes of the countries are very different. There are a few countries that are doing very well, and there are a number of countries where the incomes are very low. Now, if we have, as we feel happy about, it is a regional response, then what we actually are saying is that the hope is that each country would be able to respond to the epidemic in the way that we think it ought to. But where resources are short, the necessity of having a pool, a regional pool, so that those countries that are less capable would be able to still respond to the epidemic, that is something I think we have to seriously think about. That as a region, as we're responding to the epidemic, there has to be a pool of resources that is available so that the countries that are worst off will not be left behind. I spoke about these. The issue of, when you talk about fiscal space, and people point immediately to the high debt-GDP ratios we have. In many of the countries, the debt-to-GDP ratio is close to 100%, and in a few countries, it is in excess of 100%. But that's where fiscal reform comes in, because you can't have countries, which we do, we have countries where the per capita income is really very high, but fiscal resources are very, very low. Now, that is a crying need for fiscal reform, because as a government, if the income is being generated within the country, And as a government, you need resources to do things. You have to set up your fiscal system to ensure that enough resources come into the system. So fiscal reform is crucial. Now, the way forward, then, I'm saying that there are two things. As we said before, we expect that the donor support is going to decline. I think as a pragmatic thing, we should begin to assume that donor support is going to be cut by at least a half of what it was in 2006. It would be good for us to start behaving like that, as if that support is going to be severely cut. And it means that we then have to get our domestic sources, public and private, to really raise the resources that we need. And in this respect, I think it would be a good signal if the governments of the region decide that, look, as far as the prevention side of the program is concerned, the government is going to undertake 100% of the prevention. So whatever resources we get from outside would assist us with building our capacity on the one hand and with our treatment programs. But prevention should be the component that should be 100% within the government sphere. It means then that the basic message that I want to send, I want people to go away with today, is that we are at a time in this region, in our response, where I think if we are really serious, if we understand how serious it is as governments of the region, we have to make up our minds that we have to bear the burden of the response, that the bulk of the resources required to respond have to come from within the region, within our own countries. As we said before, the actual requirement is ridiculously small. It turns out, however, there is a mobilization problem because, as we know, in many of the countries, in most of the countries, there are serious fiscal problems. But as we mentioned, these fiscal problems are problems that could be addressed. Now, I think in this context where we have to take responsibility, I think there's something special that we should decide to do. We have seen that to cover the HIV costs, we need for now, about 0.3% of our income. Some of the preliminary work that we have done on the chronic diseases suggests that to cover the cost of that response would be a little bit more than half of 1% of our income. It means that together, the NCDs and HIV will be covered properly if we put aside 1% of our income to deal with them. And I am saying that if it's one commitment we need to make as a region, is that as countries, we should put aside 1% of our income. Now, 1%. If you're earning $1,000 a week, 1% is $10. And if you are threatened by something, and you tell me you're earning $1,000 a week and you can't put $10 aside to protect yourself, then I'm saying something is wrong with you. Right? So I'm saying that the regions have the opportunity to demonstrate how seriously they look at HIV and at the NCDs. The 1%, it is not a big amount. And it is something I think that if we really believe in the seriousness of what is facing us, we are going to respond like this. Now, some people say 1%, that's an abstract term. You should call some number for them, X million dollars. I don't like to call X million dollars for two reasons. Number one, when you call a figure how much money per year, as time goes on, of course, if that that figure remains fixed. There is inflation to think about, so that the value of that figure is going to be lost, and we don't want that. But the second reason is this. In the insurance world, we know that there's a relationship between your expected losses and the premium you will pay to protect yourself against those losses. The higher your expected loss is, the greater the premium you are willing to pay. And I'm saying that's exactly our position here. We expect, and we have been shown, that the HIV is going to decimate us. It's going to destroy our GDP. It is going to destroy our income base. So our expected losses are in terms of the income that we'll be losing. And I'm saying that if these, as our income is moving, the amount we are prepared to put up should be a fraction of that income. And what it would mean is that as the income goes up, we put aside a little bit more. If the income falls, we put aside. But at least we should link how much we put aside to what we expect to lose. So 1% will increase in numbers if, of course, our income goes up. The actual value of it will increase in numbers. So the basic point is that 1% does not seem to be an infeasible target. The question is, how do we do it? I think it means that there are two things. The question of ownership of the epidemic. Now, the ownership of the epidemic begins here. It begins in our hearts. And we have to convince the people, those persons that are in charge of deciding how to allocate resources, that the epidemic is something that is really serious. If we convince them of that, I think then it would be an easier thing to convince them that we then need to put aside resources to deal with it. It's like a war we're in a war, and we have to build up a kind of war chest. We have to build up the funds needed in order to fight the epidemic. If we take ownership of the epidemic, it is our problem. It is our problem. Let us put aside our resources to deal with it. That's the first thing. The second thing I think that we should think about is that I think the time has come when those of us in the HIV world have to really extend our hands to those in the NCD world. Because if we go looking for resources by ourselves all the time now, we are going to run into serious trouble. I think we have to find ways to link with them. And if, as I'm saying, this 1% will cover both HIV and NCDs, it is in our interest to link with the NCDs people to clamor for the 1%. On that note, I want to end. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Karl. I think two things stick out in my mind very clearly here. One is a comment you made towards the end about behavior change, about behaving as if the income is going to be cut severely and looking at least 25% and then reacting in that way so our programs can actually be sustained and expanded. But the other thing I think is a very different point than perhaps we've heard in a long while is the need for advocacy efforts to start putting out a figure, a percentage that we can approach governments with to say, allocate X% of the income for HIV and NCDs. It's perhaps something that our new UN Secretary General Envoy may be willing to take up, but it's a great opportunity for me now to just say we are exceedingly pleased in UNAIDS to have learned that the Secretary General has recently appointed the new Ambassador Special Envoy for HIV/AIDS in the Caribbean, Dr. Edward Green, and I'm pleased to say good morning to Dr. Green and congratulations. Our next speaker is Warren Buckingham. Warren is the director of the Office of Global Health and HIV for the Peace Corps. He leads that agency's participation in the U.S. President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, PEPFAR, and the Obama administration's Global Health Initiative. As the Peace Corps designated